They say that when a titan of industry dies, the world holds its breath. But what happens when his wife of 50 years is the one who finally gets to exhale? My story isn't about the grief of a widow. It's about the fury of a woman erased. For half a century, I played a role. Now the performance is over, and the truth is demanding its curtain call. They thought they buried me with him, but they only buried the woman I was pretending to be. What they don't know is that I kept the receipts. If you believe a woman's value is more than the man she stands behind, then follow my story. Like, share and hit that notification bell because the silence is about to break, and you won't want to miss the fallout. Narrator: Elizabeth. For 50 years, I was the perfect wife to a titan of industry, Richard Sterling, a name that bulldozed its way into boardrooms and newspaper headlines. My role was simpler. I was Elizabeth Sterling, the perfect hostess, the silent partner, the elegant fixture at his side. It was a performance, a marathon of quiet dignity, and I deserved an award. But there are no trophies for a lifetime of swallowed words. There is only the silence that follows. The day they lowered Richard's casket into the Greenwich soil, the silence was a physical weight. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and dying leaves, a fitting perfume for the end of an era. I stood poised and stoic in a black dress worth more than most people's cars and watched the polished mahogany disappear. I didn't cry. Tears felt like a betrayal not of him, but of the truth I had carried alone for so long. Crying would have been part of the performance, and the director was finally dead. Later, the silence followed us home. It clung to the damask curtains and suffocated the grand foyer of the house Richard built, the house I had made a home. It was an oppressive quiet, a vacuum waiting to be filled. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of funeral lilies, their white petals already starting to brown at the edges. A few dozen guests milled about, speaking in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for death and libraries. They sipped sherry and offered me condolences that felt like memorized lines. I nodded my face, a mask of serene sorrow I had perfected over decades. My son Jacob stood by the massive stone fireplace, his back to me. At 48, he still looked like a boy trying on his father's suit. It never quite fit. He was a vice president at Sterling Industries, a title Richard had bestowed upon him like a consolation prize. He wasn't a titan, he was a shadow. His wife Sarah was at his side, a hawk in Chanel. Her hand rested on his arm, not in comfort, but in control. She scanned the room, her eyes sharp, calculating. She was a woman who didn't miss a thing. My granddaughter Mia was the only one who seemed genuinely untethered. At 21, she was a whirlwind of messy bun-ripped jeans under a respectable black jacket and a phone that seemed permanently attached to her hand. She drifted near the windows, her expression a mixture of boredom and disgust. She caught my eye and gave me a small, questioning look. "Are you okay?" it asked. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of my head. No. Finally, the guests began to depart, their whispers and condolences trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. The house grew quieter still, until only the core remained, me, Jacob, Sarah, Mia, and one other, Chloe Miller. She had been standing in the corner of the living room for the last hour, a ghost at the feast. Richard's secretary, 32, with a face scrubbed clean of makeup and framed by mousy brown hair. She clutched a damp tissue in her hand, her shoulders shaking with soft, delicate sobs. A masterclass in performative grief. Richard would have been so proud. The family lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance, cleared his throat. He was a relic himself, a contemporary of Richard's, who had managed the Sterling family's legal affairs for 40 years. He looked tired, his face etched with the weary knowledge of other people's secrets. "If everyone is ready," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. Richard was very specific about the timing. We arranged ourselves in the study. Richard's sanctuary, dark wood, leather-bound books he'd never read, and a portrait of him above the desk, his expression captured in a state of permanent, ruthless ambition. I chose the armchair in the corner, a piece I had reupholstered myself 20 years ago. It felt like the only thing in the room that was truly mine. Jacob and Sarah took the leather sofa opposite the desk, sitting rigidly a united front. Mia hovered by the door, her arms crossed, radiating unease. Chloe was invited by a small, almost apologetic gesture from Arthur to take a small chair near the window, as if she were a necessary but unpleasant piece of evidence. Arthur opened his briefcase with a series of soft clicks that echoed in the tomb-like quiet. He put on a pair of reading glasses and unfolded a thick sheaf of papers. This is the last will and testament of Richard Sterling executed 3 months ago. He began, his voice formal, devoid of emotion. He droned through the usual legal preamble, the distribution of minor stocks, the donations to charities Richard had never cared about, but knew would look good in an obituary. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play about someone else's life. To my son, Jacob Sterling. Arthur read, I bequeath my controlling interest in Sterling Industries, along with the associated portfolio of secondary businesses and the sum of $10 million to be managed by the family trust. Sarah's posture softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. Jacob simply nodded, his jaw tight. He stared at his expensive smartwatch, swiping at its face as if an urgent notification had just arrived from the great beyond. He couldn't look at me. That was the first alarm bell. Arthur continued listing off smaller bequests. A trust fund for Mia, generous, but controlled by her parents until she was 30. A pension for the long-serving housekeeper. It was all procedural, all expected. I waited for my name for the part of the script where the devoted wife is acknowledged and rewarded for her 50-year service. Arthur took a sip of water. He seemed to brace himself. And now, he said, his eyes fixed on the page, we come to the primary estate, the property at 145 Willow Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut, and all its contents. He paused. The silence in the room became a roar. This was it. The house. My home. And the remainder of all liquid assets, private accounts and investments held outside the corporate trust valued at approximately $180 million. My heart didn't beat faster. It simply stopped. I watched Jacob. He was staring intently at his watch, his thumb stroking the smooth glass. Sarah had her hand on his knee, her knuckles white. They knew. Arthur cleared his throat one last time. These assets in their entirety I bequeath to my loyal and devoted confidant for her unwavering support and understanding. He looked up from the paper, his gaze reluctantly finding mine for a fraction of a second before flitting away. Miss Chloe Miller. Chloe? The words didn't explode in the room. They landed with a soft, sickening thud, absorbing all the sound, all the air. My gaze, slow and deliberate, moved from Arthur's pained face, past my son's averted eyes, past Sarah's mask of rehearsed sympathy, and landed on Chloe. She let out a theatrical gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, the damp tissue crushed against her lips. Fresh tears welled, spilling down her cheeks in perfect, glistening tracks. They were tears of a lottery winner, not a grieving employee. She looked shocked, but it was the feigned shock of an actress who had known her lines all along. Me, she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. I don't understand. Why would he? It was Jacob and Sarah's reaction, or lack thereof, that confirmed everything. There was no outrage, no confusion. Jacob finally looked up from his watch, his expression not one of shock, but of pained resignation. He glanced at me, a flicker of something guilt-pity before his eyes skated away. Sarah was the one who moved first. She rose from the sofa and glided over to Chloe, her movements smooth and practiced. She wrapped an arm around the younger woman's shaking shoulders. "It's okay, Chloe," Sarah said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "It's a lot to take in. We know. Richard. Richard spoke of you often. He cared for you a great deal." The sympathy was rehearsed. The grief was a hollow echo. The entire scene was a pre-written, pre-approved tragedy, and I was the only one who hadn't been given the script. I looked at my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose fears of the dark I had soothed. He refused to meet my gaze. In his silence, in Sarah's predatory comfort, I saw the truth. This wasn't a bombshell. It was a planned demolition, and I was the one left standing in the rubble. The air in Richard's study grew colder, heavier. Arthur Vance packed his briefcase with a funereal slowness, his movements careful, as if any sudden noise might shatter the fragile, toxic tableau. He murmured his final, formal condolences, his eyes avoiding mine, and saw himself out. The click of the front door closing was a sound of finality. It was no longer my door. We were left in the suffocating quiet, the four of them and me. Chloe was still performing her role as the bewildered heiress, dabbing at her dry eyes. Mia stood frozen by the door, her face pale with a rage she couldn't yet articulate. I remained in my armchair, a queen on a throne in a kingdom that had just been signed away. My mind was eerily calm. The shock had bypassed emotion and gone straight to a state of crystalline clarity. The betrayal wasn't a wound. It was a lens bringing 50 years of blurry, ignored details into sharp, painful focus. It was Sarah who broke the silence, her voice as smooth as polished marble, designed to soothe while it cut. "Elizabeth." She began turning from Chloe with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile of management, of HR, of someone handling a delicate but necessary termination. "Jacob and I have been thinking a great deal about what's best for you now. This has all been such a shock." She paused, letting the lie hang in the air. "We've done some research, and we've found you a wonderful room at the Silver Creek Meadows facility. It's the best in the state. Top-tier care. Chef-prepared meals, social activities, a garden." It wasn't an offer. It was an eviction notice wrapped in the brochure of a 5-star prison. Silver Creek Meadows. I'd heard of it. It was where the wealthy families of Greenwich sent their inconveniently long-living parents to fade into obscurity. A place of polite, sterile neglect. I turned my head to look at my son. "Jacob." My voice was steady, betraying none of the seismic shift happening within me. He finally looked at me, but his gaze was unfocused, directed somewhere over my shoulder. He stopped fiddling with his smartwatch and shoved his hands into his pockets. "Mum, it's for the best." He mumbled the words, tumbling out in a rush. "The house. It's a lot to manage on your own. The upkeep, the memories. It would be too much for you. Sarah and I, we just want you to be comfortable. To be safe." Safe. The word was an insult. For 50 years I had managed this house, managed Richard, managed the intricate social and emotional ecosystem of this family. Now I was being deemed incapable of managing myself. He wasn't concerned for my safety. He was ensuring his own. He was clearing the board. "I see," I said softly. The calmness of my own voice surprised me. It was as if I were floating above the scene, an observer to my own life's dismantling. Sarah, emboldened by my lack of hysterics, pressed her advantage. She saw my stillness not as strength, but as senile acquiescence. She saw a frail old woman who had already been defeated. She walked towards Mia, who was still standing by the door like a statue of silent judgment. "Mia, darling," Sarah cooed, placing a hand on her daughter's arm. Mia flinched, pulling away as if she'd been burned. Sarah ignored it. "I know this is hard for you to understand. Your grandmother is going to a lovely new place, and Chloe—" She gestured magnanimously towards the still sniffling woman in the chair. "Chloe will be staying here, taking care of the house. It's a transition for all of us." She took a breath, preparing for the final, unimaginable insult. She looked directly at Mia, but her words were aimed at me. Each one was a perfectly polished stone designed to shatter the last vestiges of my identity. "And Mia, we all need you to be strong for the family now. It's time to start thinking of Chloe as well as your stepmom." The word hung in the air. Stepmom. It was grotesque. A monument to my erasure. A single word that wiped out 50 years of marriage, of motherhood, of grandmotherhood. It demoted me from matriarch to a footnote while elevating this tear-stained usurper to my place. It was an act of such profound, calculated cruelty that it transcended mere greed. It was a psychological execution. I watched Chloe's face. She offered a weak, pathetic smile, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as she looked from Sarah to me, as if seeking approval for her new, unearned title. "Oh, Sarah," she murmured a faint protest. I couldn't possibly." But she made no real objection. She was accepting the role. She was trying on the crown. A small, sharp sound cut through the tension. A scoff. It came from Mia. Her face, which had been pale with shock, was now flushed with a deep, furious red. "Are you kidding me?" she breathed, her voice low and trembling. "Stepmom, you can't be serious." "Mia, that's enough." Jacob snapped, his paternal authority ringing false. "This is not the time." "Not the time." Mia's voice rose, cracking with disbelief. "Dad, she's your mother, and you're throwing her out, and you want me to call her." She jabbed a finger in Chloe's direction. "Stepmom. That is the most disgusting thing I have ever heard. Mia, you are being hysterical." Sarah said, her voice turning sharp, the silken glove coming off to reveal the iron fist. "You're a child. You don't understand adult matters. This is what your grandfather wanted. His will was perfectly clear." What your grandfather wanted. The phrase was a shield they hid behind a justification for their own avarice and cowardice. They were merely carrying out the final orders of the Titan. I looked from my son's guilty face to my daughter-in-law's triumphant one. I looked at the weeping impostor who now owned my home. And I looked at my granddaughter, the only person in the room whose heart was not corrupted. Her disgust was a mirror reflecting the true horror of the situation back at them. Under the table, hidden from their view, I saw her thumb moving deftly across the screen of her phone. She had been doing it for some time. I didn't know what it meant then, but a flicker of instinct, a primal maternal knowledge told me it was important. I rose slowly from my armchair. All eyes turned to me. I expected my legs to tremble, my voice to break. They did not. The cold, crystalline clarity inside me was hardening into something else, something solid, something like steel. "You have made your arrangements," I said, my voice even. "I will need some time to pack a few personal items." Sarah's face flooded with relief. "Of course, Elizabeth. Take all the time you need. We'll have a car for you in the morning." A car to the nursing home. I walked past them, my back straight. I didn't look at Jacob. I didn't look at Sarah. I didn't look at Chloe. As I passed Mia, I let my fingers brush against her arm. It was a fleeting touch, but it was a signal. "I see you. Thank you." I walked up the grand staircase, each step an echo of a life that was no longer mine. They thought the story was over. They thought they had written the final chapter. They had no idea I was about to begin an entirely new book. That night, the guest room felt like a cell. It was a beautiful room, of course. Everything in this house was beautiful, but it was impersonal. The bedspread was a bland, hotel-grade beige. The art on the walls was a series of generic floral prints. It was a room for visitors, for people who didn't belong. After 50 years, I was a visitor in my own home. My luggage, hastily packed by the housekeeper at Sarah's direction, sat by the door. Most of my life had been condensed into 3 leather suitcases. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Downstairs, I could occasionally hear the low murmur of voices, Jacob, Sarah, and their new housemate Chloe, planning the next phase of their coup. They were probably discussing logistics. When to change the locks. How to liquidate my husband's assets. How to spin the story to their friends. Poor Elizabeth, she's just not coping well with the grief. It's for the best. I knew the script because I had watched Richard use similar tactics to sideline business rivals for decades. I just never thought his own son would learn the lesson so well. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," I said, my voice raspy. Mia slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Her face was still blotchy from crying, but her eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. She held her phone in her hand, as if it were a weapon. "Graham," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "I am so sorry. I can't believe them. I can't believe Dad. Your father," I said the words, tasting like ash, "has always done what he believed was necessary to secure his father's approval, even now." Mia shook her head, pacing the small space between the bed and the door. "This isn't about Grandpa's approval. This is monstrous. Sarah is a vulture, and Dad is just letting her. He's a coward." She stopped pacing and looked at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "Graham, I did something. In the study, I recorded them." She held up her phone. "The whole thing. From when Sarah started talking about Silver Creek Meadows, I got it all. The stepmom comment. Everything." My breath caught in my throat. A digital native fluent in the language of quiet rebellion. Her thumb, which I had seen moving under the table, hadn't been idle scrolling. It had been an act of preservation, an act of witness. "I don't know if it's legal or whatever," she rushed on, "but I couldn't just sit there. I couldn't let them say those things and have it just disappear into the air. I thought you should see it, so you know you're not crazy. So you can see it for what it is without all the polite bullshit." She came and sat next to me on the bed. Her shoulder brushed against mine. She tapped the screen, and the scene from the study replayed itself in miniature. The video was raw, a little shaky, but the audio was perfectly clear. "We've found you a wonderful room at the Silver Creek Meadows facility. Top-tier care." Sarah's voice so reasonable, so smooth. On the small screen, stripped of the grand setting, her condescension was stark ugly. "The house. It's a lot to manage on your own." My son's mumbled excuses, his averted eyes. On camera, his weakness wasn't tragic. It was pathetic. Then came the final blow. "It's time to start thinking of Chloe as your stepmom." The grotesque word captured and contained in a digital file. I watched the scene play out, not with the tears I had refused to shed earlier, but with a glacial calm. The pain was still there, a deep, tectonic ache, but something new was forming over it, a layer of ice, hard, unbreakable. Seeing their cruelty laid bare, stripped of its polite veneer, didn't break me, it forged me. Mia watched my face, her own expression anxious. "Graham, are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time since Richard's casket had been lowered into the ground, a genuine emotion surfaced on my face. It wasn't sorrow. It was a slow, cold smile. They think I'm a relic. I whispered the words, scraping my throat. The voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded older, stronger. They think the story is over because the author is dead. They think I'm just a character he wrote, and now that my part is done, I can be put away on a shelf to gather dust. I stood up, moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I went to my largest suitcase, the one containing the things the housekeeper hadn't thought important. I knelt down and unzipped a hidden compartment in the lining, my fingers steady and sure closed around a small antique rosewood box. It was heavy for its size, the wood smooth and dark with age. The lock was a simple brass clasp. It wasn't locked to keep people out. It was closed to keep the contents in. Mia watched me, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What is that?" I carried the box back to the bed and set it down between us. The wood felt cool to the touch. Richard was a man of grand gestures and grand lies. I said, my voice gaining strength. He thought I was a fool. He thought his affairs, his deceptions, his cruelties. He thought they were all secrets he kept from me. He never understood that I was the one keeping them for him. I was his living vault. I ran my fingers over the intricate carving on the lid. Every time he lied, every time he betrayed me and thought he'd gotten away with it, I took a souvenir. A small token. Something to prove it had happened. Something to prove I wasn't crazy. He thought I was burying the evidence, but I was just collecting it. My gaze met Mia's. The fire I felt inside me was now reflected in her eyes. The spark of rebellion she had carried was about to meet a lifetime's worth of fuel. "They think this house is Richard's legacy," I said, my voice dropping to a low, determined whisper. "They think his money is his power. They have no idea what he made me bury. They have no idea what secrets are really holding up the foundations of this family." I rested my hand on the cool wood of the rosewood box. "And now?" I said the words, a vow, a declaration of war. "I'm going to dig it all up." The small brass key felt cold and alien in Elizabeth's hand. It had lived in the back of her jewelry armoire for 50 years, a question she never dared to ask. Now, it was the only answer that mattered. The rosewood box sat on the polished dining table, its grain dark and deep, like clotted blood. It seemed to absorb the light in the room, a small black hole of history. Mia watched her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She was vibrating with a nervous energy, the righteous anger of youth ready to be aimed. Elizabeth's hand was steady as she inserted the key. The lock turned with a dry, grinding click, a sound that echoed across 5 decades of silence. She lifted the lid. Mia leaned forward, expecting to see stock certificates, deeds, a hidden will. Her brow furrowed in confusion. The box was nearly empty. It held no legal power, no financial leverage. It was just debris, a collection of forgotten things. Elizabeth looked at the contents, not with the frantic energy of a treasure hunter, but with the quiet reverence of a curator visiting a tomb. Her long, elegant fingers, still beautiful, despite the faint tracery of age spots, hovered over the objects. "What is this?" Grandma Mia's voice was a whisper. "Junk. No, darling." Elizabeth's voice was low and raspy, the sound of disuse. "Not junk. Receipts." She gently lifted the first item. It was a gardenia once white, now the brittle yellowed colour of old paper. A few petals flaked away into dust as she held it. "August 1975, our 5th anniversary. Richard was supposed to be at a conference in Chicago. He came home a day late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine. He handed me this flower." She looked at Mia, her eyes clear and sharp. "He said the hotel lobby was filled with them, and the scent made him miss me so much he had to come home early. I found the receipt for a lady's watch from a jeweler in Boston in his coat pocket the next day. I never said a word. I just pressed the flower. She set the fragile blossom down and picked up the next object, a single heavy cufflink. It was gold, with a smooth black onyx inlay. It felt cold and significant in her palm. This was from 1990. He claimed he lost its partner at a charity gala. He made such a show of being upset of how it was his favourite pair, a gift from his father. He had me call the venue the valet the dry cleaner for weeks. A grand performance of loss. She paused, her gaze distant. A month later, I saw a picture in a society column. A man named Julian Vance was wearing the exact same pair, Richard's business rival, the man he was systematically destroying in the press. Her voice dropped. Richard hadn't lost the cufflink. He'd planted it. A small piece of himself left behind to taunt a man he was breaking. Next, she lifted a ticket stub. The paper was faded, the text barely legible. Tosca, the Metropolitan Opera, November 14, 1995. He told me he was taking a client. Elizabeth said, her voice flat, devoid of the original pain. It was a scar, now not a wound. A boring old investor from Germany. He said I'd hate it. All that shouting in a language you don't understand, my love. Stay home. I'll be back before midnight. She ran her thumb over the date. He didn't come home until dawn. Finally, her fingers traced the last item, the most unsettling of all. It was a child's drawing on a piece of creased, yellowed construction paper. The wax crayon drawing was crude, but cheerful. A stick-figure man with a briefcase, a stick-figure woman with a triangle dress, and a smaller stick figure between them, all standing under a vibrant, multicolored rainbow. In the bottom right corner, a single letter was scrawled shaky and backwards. C. Mia stared at it. Who drew this? Elizabeth looked from the drawing to Mia, and for the first time, a flicker of the old pain, the raw, unprocessed grief, clouded her eyes. I don't know, she admitted softly. He came home from a business trip. He was different, distracted, for weeks. I found this in his briefcase. When I asked him about it, he laughed. He said it was from the daughter of a business associate, a silly little thing he'd kept to be polite. She carefully placed the drawing back in the box. He looked me in the eye and lied. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, but it was his eyes. They were cold, victorious. She closed the lid, the soft click, sealing the ghosts back inside. She looked at her granddaughter, whose face was a mask of dawning comprehension. Every object in that box is a lie, he told me. Elizabeth said, her voice gaining a strange, hard strength. A lie he was so proud of, so confident in that he thought I believed it completely. He never realized I was collecting them. Not as mementos of my pain, Mia, as receipts for his soul. Mia's confusion had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She looked at the box, then at her grandmother. The anger that had been a wild, unfocused fire was now being honed to a fine point. She wasn't just a witness to her grandmother's eviction anymore. She was the archivist of a 50-year war. Okay, Mia said, her voice low and steady. She pulled her laptop from her bag, the modern sheen of the brushed metal, a stark contrast to the ancient wood of the box. Okay, Grandma. Let's cash them in. The quiet hum of the laptop filled the cavernous dining room. Mia became a digital archaeologist, her fingers flying across the keyboard, turning her grandmother's fragile memories into search queries. The past wasn't buried in earth and stone anymore. It was buried in archived web pages, cached data, and the digital ghosts of forgotten news sites. She started with the opera ticket. Tosca, the Metropolitan Opera, November 14, 1995. It felt like a flimsy lead, a whisper from a quarter century ago. She cross-referenced the date with archived society pages from the New York papers, her screen filling with grainy photos of socialites in dated gowns and tuxedos. It was a tedious, soul-crushing search through a sea of smiling, wealthy faces. For 2 hours, she found nothing. Dead ends, broken links, paywalls for defunct publications. Maybe it's nothing, Mia murmured, rubbing her tired eyes. Keep looking, Elizabeth said from her armchair, where she sat perfectly still, a statue of patience. Richard never did anything without a reason. Vanity was his engine. Mia changed tactics. She started searching for charity galas and society events that happened on the same night. Finally, on the archived site of a niche luxury lifestyle magazine, she found it. A post titled, "A Night at the Opera, the Vanguard Annual Donor Gala." She scrolled through the low-resolution gallery, and there he was, Richard. Younger, his hair darker, but with the same predatory smile. He was beaming his arm possessively around the waist of a woman. A stunning woman, with dark, intelligent eyes and a cascade of auburn hair. It was not Elizabeth. The caption beneath the photo read, "Evergreen Capital CEO Richard Davenport with the lovely Eleanor Vance." Grandma Mia's voice was tight. She turned the laptop screen. Elizabeth stared at the image. She showed no surprise, only a deep, weary recognition. It was as if she were looking at a photograph of a storm she had known was coming, had felt in her bones for years, but had never actually seen. Eleanor, she said the name, a strange shape in her mouth. So that was her name. Mia's fingers were already moving. A search for Eleanor Vance brought up a flurry of results from the 90s. Articles from financial papers, mentions in society columns. She was married to Julian Vance. Julian Vance. The name resonated with Mia from the cufflink story. She pulled the single onyx-inlaid cufflink from the box and used her phone to take a high-resolution photo. She ran a reverse image search, then a more specific search focusing on boutique men's jewelers from the 1980s and 90s. It was a long shot, but after an hour of navigating clunky, decade-old websites, she found a match in the digital catalogue of a custom jeweler in Manhattan. The design was called the Titan. The description noted it was a limited run of 20 pairs commissioned in 1988. One of the listed original buyers was Julian Vance. Mia felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. Grandma, Julian Vance, Richard's rival, the man he bankrupted. He didn't just bankrupt him, Elizabeth said, her voice hollow. He humiliated him. He stripped him of his reputation, his friends, his dignity. He turned the entire city against him. Richard called it a hostile takeover. It was never about business. It was a dissection. He enjoyed taking him apart piece by piece. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more monstrous than Mia could have imagined. An affair wasn't just an affair. It was a weapon. The cufflink wasn't just a trophy. It was a declaration of dominance over a man whose life and whose wife Richard had decided to take. Just as Mia was about to dive deeper into the Vance family, her phone buzzed with a notification. Then another. And another. She glanced at the screen. It was a tag on an Instagram post. She clicked it open, and the cold dread turned into a hot, sickening rage. It was Sarah's account. A professionally lit, artfully staged photo of Chloe. She was standing in the grand living room of the Greenwich House Elizabeth's living room, arranging a bouquet of white lilies in a vase on the mantelpiece. She was smiling, a soft, serene expression on her face. The caption written by Sarah was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. A new season of life in this beautiful home. So grateful for Chloe Miller, who is bringing so much light and grace as we honor Richard's incredible legacy. She is a true blessing to our family. Family. First. Honoring his legacy. New beginnings. Legacy. The comments section was a tidal wave of sycophantic poison. She looks so at home, Richard knew what he was doing. So glad the family is embracing her. A beautiful soul. Class and grace. The perfect person to carry on his name. Jacob, your father would be so proud of you and Sarah for handling this with such dignity. Mia felt like she was going to be sick. They're rewriting history in real time, she whispered, showing the phone to Elizabeth. They're erasing you. Elizabeth looked at the photo of Chloe, standing in her place at the fawning comments declaring her a saint. The public narrative was being cemented with every like, every share. Elizabeth was being cast as the villain in the final act of her own life, the bitter, grasping old woman refusing to accept the great man's final benevolent wishes. The humiliation was a physical blow. It didn't feel like the sharp sting of the will reading. This was different. This was a slow, suffocating poison. And it unlocked a memory Elizabeth had buried for 30 years, a memory sealed away behind a wall of willful ignorance. The memory rose unbidden and vivid, the scent of rain on hot asphalt, the look on Richard's face a mask of concerned sincerity. It was 1995, the same year as the opera. Her brother David had been worried about her. He'd seen the way Richard dismissed her in public, the way her light was dimming. He'd offered to look over some of their joint investments, a portfolio Elizabeth had brought into the marriage. It was a kind gesture from a loving brother. Richard had found out. He hadn't yelled. Yelling was for men who had lost control. Richard was always in control. He sat her down in this very room, took her hands in his expression one of profound hurt. "Lizzie, my love." He had said, his voice a balm of practiced reason. "I know David means well, but he doesn't understand our world. He's looking at the numbers and he's getting greedy. I saw the documents he was preparing. He's trying to leverage your family's assets to cut me out." "David would never do that," she had said, her voice small. "Of course you'd think that. You see the best in everyone. It's why I love you." Richard had cooed, stroking her hand. "But I see the world for what it is. A battlefield. He sees your inheritance not as our shared future, but as his opportunity. He's trying to steal from us, from Jacob, from the life we've built." He presented her with a complex web of lies peppered with financial jargon she didn't understand, twisting her brother's concern into a narrative of betrayal. He made her believe it. He made her feel that her doubt was a betrayal of him, of their marriage. He isolated her from the one person in the world, besides her son, who was unequivocally on her side. She had called David the next day, and reading from a script Richard had helped her write, accused him of trying to undermine her husband. The line had gone silent for a long moment, before David had whispered, "I don't know who you are anymore, Liz," and hung up. They hadn't spoken since. Staring at the Instagram post on Mia's phone, Elizabeth finally understood. The lie about her brother wasn't just a lie. It was a strategy. It was the severing of her last lifeline to a world that existed outside of Richard's control. He hadn't just wanted her love. He had wanted her entire reality. He had built the walls of her prison, and for 50 years she had mistaken them for the walls of a fortress built to protect her. Now she saw the bars, the lock on the door. His control hadn't been part of their life. It had been the entire architecture of it. A new kind of fire began to burn in Elizabeth's chest, melting away the cold, quiet grief. It was rage, pure clarifying, and decades overdue. "They are not erasing me," she said, her voice like flint. She looked at Mia, her eyes blazing. "They are giving me a stage." She pointed a trembling finger at Mia's laptop. "Keep digging. Find out what happened to Eleanor Vance." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Fueled by the galling hypocrisy of Sarah's social media campaign, Mia dug with a new ferocity. She wasn't just looking for information anymore. She was looking for a weapon. The search for Eleanor Vance, post 1995, yielded fewer and fewer results. The vibrant socialite seemed to slowly fade from the digital record, her name disappearing from gala announcements and society columns. It was like watching a star burn out. Then Mia's digital excavation struck not gold, but a tombstone. A series of short, stark articles from the spring of 1996. The headlines were brutal. Wife of disgraced magnate, Julian Vance dead in apparent suicide. Eleanor Vance, tragedy. A family in ruins. Police rule out foul play in Vance death. Mia's blood ran cold. She read the clipped, dispassionate prose of the articles. Eleanor Vance, 34, had been found in her Upper East Side apartment. The cause of death was an overdose. Her husband, Julian, whose financial empire had spectacularly collapsed the year prior, was described as inconsolable. The articles mentioned that Eleanor had been treated for depression following her husband's public ruin. And then came the line that made Mia's breath catch in her throat. Mrs. Vance is survived by her husband and their young daughter. A daughter? Mia's hands trembled as she typed. She dug deeper past the mainstream news reports into archived local news servers and public record databases, places where the grim details of life and death are stored without sentiment. She was looking for something specific, a horrible hunch solidifying in her gut. She found a link to a scanned copy of the official coroner's summary report. It was a dry, bureaucratic document, full of clinical terminology. But under the section titled Personal Effects Found at Scene was a short itemized list. 1 ladies' wristwatch designer brand. 1 empty prescription bottle. 1 handwritten note, contents sealed. 1 child's drawing on colored paper depicting a family under a rainbow. Mia stopped breathing. A child's drawing, depicting a family under a rainbow. She looked over at the rosewood box, its lid now closed. She saw the crude drawing in her mind's eye. The stick figure family, the vibrant, hopeful rainbow, and the shaky, backwards C in the corner. C for Chloe. The truth crashed down on Mia with the force of a physical impact. It was horrifying. It was monstrous. It rearranged the entire world. Chloe wasn't just some young secretary Richard had taken a liking to. Chloe was Eleanor Vance's daughter. Richard's affair hadn't just been a betrayal of his marriage. It had been the opening salvo in a war to destroy another family. He hadn't just coveted the woman. He had orchestrated the complete annihilation of her world to possess her. And when she had been lost to him, driven to despair by the ruin he had engineered, he had done one last unspeakable thing. He had taken the child. He had stolen her. A secret prize plucked from the wreckage he had created. Chloe Miller was not Richard's mentee. She was his living trophy. Shaking, Mia slowly turned the laptop to her grandmother. She didn't have to say a word. Elizabeth's eyes scanned the text of the coroner's report, her face becoming a pale, rigid mask. She saw the description of the drawing, and a sound escaped her lips, a small, broken thing, the sound of a truth too terrible to bear, finally being spoken aloud. Mia felt a wave of nausea. She looked at her grandmother, a woman she had always seen as quiet, elegant, and tragically wronged. But now a new, terrible question emerged. Grandma Mia's voice was barely a whisper, thick with dread. Did you know who she was? The silence in the room became immense, heavy with the weight of decades. Elizabeth didn't look at the screen anymore. Her gaze was turned inward, excavating a memory she had walled up, a truth she had made a pact with hell to keep. The strength, the fire she had felt moments ago seemed to drain away, leaving behind an old, old weariness. I knew about the child, she confessed, her voice thin and brittle, like the dried gardenia. The admission cost her everything. The years she had spent cultivating the image of the unknowing, dignified wife crumbled to dust in that single sentence. Mia flinched as if struck. "You knew." "Not at first," Elizabeth said, her eyes pleading with Mia to understand a choice she barely understood herself. "Not for years. It was long after Eleanor was gone. Jacob was in college. Richard came to me one night. He was gloating. He'd had too much brandy. He told me he had an obligation he'd been taking care of, a youthful mistake that was costing him a small fortune in tuition and board." She recounted the memory, the words tasting like ash. Richard hadn't been confessing. He had been bragging. He told her about a little girl, his daughter, living in a boarding school in New Hampshire under a different name. He painted it as an act of charity, a burden he was nobly shouldering. "He told me her name was Chloe Elizabeth," whispered. "He never mentioned Eleanor. He never mentioned Julian. He made it sound like a brief, meaningless affair from long ago. He made me complicit. He swore me to secrecy." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of a profound, soul-deep shame. "He told me the truth would destroy Jacob, that a scandal would shatter his future, his career prospects, the name he was meant to inherit. He used my love for my son to forge my silence. He turned me into his co-conspirator. Every check he wrote for her tuition, every holiday she spent alone at that school. I knew, and I did nothing." The room was still. The pieces now formed a complete grotesque mosaic. Jacob and Sarah's sickening compliance, their eagerness to welcome Chloe, their shameless social media campaign, it all snapped into focus. "They know," Mia said. "It wasn't a question. Jacob and Sarah. They know the whole story." Elizabeth nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "Richard told them before he died. He bought their silence. He paid them to play their parts. And then the final devastating truth of the will became clear. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't about love or legacy, or even rewarding a loyal employee. It was Richard's posthumous masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was a message sent from beyond the grave. He didn't leave Chloe the house to provide for her. Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with a new, horrifying understanding. He did it to prove a point. To me. To Jacob. To the world. He wanted to show that his secret legacy, his stolen bloodline, was superior to the legitimate family he paraded in public. He wanted to install the daughter of the woman he destroyed into my home, and have my own son, and daughter-in-law applaud as she did it. The cruelty, Mia, the cruelty was the entire point. The will wasn't a gift to Chloe. It was a final, brutal stab at Elizabeth. It was designed to invalidate her entire life, her 50 years of marriage, her role as a wife and mother. And the inheritance Jacob was so proud of. It wasn't a reward for his loyalty. It was blood money, a payment for betraying his own mother and endorsing his father's monstrous legacy. Chloe wasn't the beneficiary. She was the weapon, and Elizabeth had just been handed the schematics that explained exactly how she worked. The weight of grief had not lessened, but it had changed its form. It was no longer a suffocating blanket, but a lens grinding away the soft focus of 50 years and leaving only the hard, sharp edges of reality. The sorrow was still there, a low hum beneath the floorboards of her heart, but another sound had joined it, the clean, quiet click of a machine being calibrated. Elizabeth sat in her small, temporary apartment, the air smelling of fresh paint and new beginnings, a scent that felt like a cruel irony. Across from her, Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop glowing in the dim light. The digital files they had unearthed were no longer a chaotic jumble of pain. They were now organized, categorized, and weaponized. They were exhibits. "He's the one," Elizabeth said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was a commander's voice. She pointed a steady finger at the screen, at the face of a man in his late 40s, his expression a practiced mix of earnestness and skepticism. Ben Carter, host of The Ledger, a man who built his empire on the ruins of others. He doesn't just report stories, he prosecutes them in the court of public opinion. Mia looked up, her young face etched with a gravity that didn't belong to her years. Are you sure, Grandma, these guys, they can turn on you? They chew people up. They chew up victims, my dear. Elizabeth corrected gently. They feast on desperation. We are not going to be desperate. We are going to be a business opportunity. She took a deep breath. I am not going to call him and cry. I'm not going to beg for him to believe the ramblings of a forgotten old woman. I am going to make him an offer, an exclusive, the kind of story that wins awards and triples listenership overnight. Mia nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't a plea for help. This was a corporate takeover, just of a different kind. What's the pitch? The rot at the heart of the American dream. Elizabeth said the words tasting like ash. The story of how a titan of industry, Richard Sterling, a man lauded for his philanthropy and business acumen, built his legacy on a foundation of lies, emotional terrorism, and a stolen child. A story complete with digital, financial, and photographic evidence. And for the finale, she paused, the first-hand exclusive testimony of the one person who was there for all of it. The woman he thought he had silenced forever. Mia's fingers flew across the keyboard. She pulled up a secure, encrypted email service. What do I write? Nothing, Elizabeth said. Get me his producer's direct line. This is not a conversation for emails. This is a conversation for the human voice. A few minutes later, Mia held out the phone. His gatekeeper, a woman named Anya. Elizabeth took the phone. Her hand did not tremble. The grief was an anchor now holding her steady in the storm she was about to unleash. Anya, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Sterling. There was a pause on the other end, a flicker of recognition. Mrs. Sterling, my condolences on your husband's passing. The voice was professional, but wary. Thank you, Elizabeth said, her tone crisp. I'm not calling for condolences. I'm calling to schedule a 10-minute conversation between myself and Mr. Carter. I have a proposal for him. It concerns a story of national interest involving the Sterling family, the late Julian Vance, and a multi-decade corporate fraud. I have verifiable evidence that has not been seen by any other journalistic entity. Tell him if he wants the biggest story of his career, he will find 10 minutes for me. The silence on the other end was profound. Anya was no doubt used to frantic tipsters, conspiracy theorists, and the desperate. She was not used to this calm, surgical precision. I see. Can you give me any more specifics? No, Elizabeth said flatly. The specifics are for Mr. Carter alone. Exclusivity is the most valuable commodity I have, and I will not devalue it by discussing it with anyone else. Tell him that. He'll understand. She took a small, calculated risk. And you can tell him the story ends with a living, breathing woman, currently residing in my late husband's home, who has no idea she is the daughter of the woman he drove to suicide. She heard a sharp intake of breath. The hook was set. I will pass along the message, Mrs. Sterling. I expect his call within the hour, Elizabeth said, and hung up. She looked at Mia, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and awe. And now, Elizabeth said, a strange, hollow calm settling over her, we wait for the enemy to show their hand. The call from Ben Carter himself came in 47 minutes. It was short, tense, and electrifying. He asked probing questions, trying to poke holes in her story. He was a predator, sniffing for weakness. But Elizabeth gave him none. She answered with facts, timelines, and the cold, hard logic of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. She didn't give him the whole story, just the chapter headings: the hostile takeover, the affair with Eleanor Vance, the suicide, the child, the fraudulent will. By the end of the call, his skepticism had melted away, replaced by a barely concealed, ravenous hunger. "My team will need to vet this, Mrs. Sterling," he'd said, his voice a low thrum of excitement. "Every piece of data. Your team can have it all," Elizabeth had replied. "After you've agreed to my terms. I control the narrative. The story is told through my eyes. It airs when I say it airs. No edits without my final approval. This is not a negotiation." There was a long pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Mrs. Sterling," Ben Carter had said, "I think this is the beginning of a beautiful partnership." The enemy showed their hand 2 days later. An email, cold and formal, arrived in Elizabeth's inbox. It was from Jacob's lawyer. A final meeting was requested at the Greenwich House to resolve all outstanding matters and sign the necessary paperwork. It was a summons cloaked in the language of legal civility. Mia read it over Elizabeth's shoulder. "It's a trap." "Of course it is, dear," Elizabeth said, looking out the window at the grey Connecticut sky. "They think I'm broken. They think I've been weeping in a corner, defeated. They're going to sit me down, pat my hand, and have me sign away the last vestiges of my life for a pittance and a room in a comfortable facility. They need my signature to make it all clean, to legitimize the theft. We're not going, are we?" Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Elizabeth turned from the window, and for the first time in days, a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who hosted galas and charmed board members, appeared in her eyes. It was a faint, dangerous smile. "Oh, we are absolutely going," she said. "But we are not going to a surrender. We are going to a premiere." The drive to Greenwich was a journey back in time. Each familiar turn, each old stone wall was a ghost. Elizabeth sat in the passenger seat of Mia's modest sedan, watching the scenery blur past. This wasn't her world anymore. It was a museum of a life she had once lived. She felt strangely detached, as if she were a tourist visiting a foreign land. Mia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "I set up the channel. It's private invitation only. Ben Carter has the link. He said he's sharing it with a few friends, top-tier journalists from the Times, the Post." And he had another idea. "Oh." He used his own contacts in Greenwich. He sent the link to a dozen of the town's biggest names. The ones who served on boards with you. The ones who played golf with Richard. The ones whose wives you had lunch with for 40 years. He told them it was a live statement from you that they would not want to miss. Elizabeth closed her eyes. The perfection of it was almost poetic. Jacob and Sarah weren't just trying to disown her. They were trying to erase her from the social fabric of their world. Now that very world would be a silent, invisible jury to their downfall. "Is the stream active?" Elizabeth asked, as they turned onto the long, familiar driveway, the grand house looming at its end like a mausoleum. Mia tapped her phone propped discreetly on the dashboard. A small, pulsing red light appeared in the corner of the screen. "We're live," she whispered. They pulled to a stop. Elizabeth looked at the house. Her house. For 50 years it had been her sanctuary and her prison. Today it would be her stage. "Are you ready, Grandma?" Mia's voice was barely a whisper. Elizabeth placed her hand over Mia's. "I've been rehearsing for this day for 50 years, darling," she said, her voice steady. "I just didn't know it." They walked up the stone path, 2 women against a dynasty. One old, one young. One armed with a lifetime of truth, the other with the technology to broadcast it to the world. The heavy oak door swung open before they reached it. Jacob stood there, his face a mask of strained patience. He was dressed in a suit that looked too tight, a man playing the part of a patriarch he hadn't earned. "Mother," he said, the word clipped. "You're late." "The truly important people always are," Elizabeth replied, sweeping past him into the foyer. The grand living room was just as she remembered, yet entirely alien. The air was thick with a cloying tension, heavy with the scent of Lily's funeral flowers still lingering like a bad memory. Sarah was there, perched on a silk armchair, like a vulture on a branch, her smile thin and sharp. Beside her, a man with a shiny briefcase and a perpetually worried expression, their lawyer, a Mr. Davies. And standing near the fireplace, bathed in the soft afternoon light, was Chloe Miller. She was playing her part to perfection, the reluctant heiress, her face a carefully constructed portrait of gentle sorrow and deference. She wore a simple, elegant grey dress, the picture of quiet dignity. It was a masterful performance. Elizabeth. Sarah said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We're so glad you decided to be reasonable. Reason has very little to do with today, Sarah. Elizabeth said, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the audience both visible and invisible. She and Mia sat on the sofa opposite them. Mia placed her purse on the cushion beside her, the camera lens of her phone peeking out perfectly positioned to capture the entire scene. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, opening his briefcase with a loud snap that echoed in the tense silence. Mrs. Sterling, if we could begin? We have here a standard relinquishment agreement. It formalizes your acceptance of the terms outlined in your late husband's will and waives any future claims against the estate. In return, Jacob and Sarah have arranged for a generous stipend and secured you a premier suite at the Silver Creek senior residence. He slid a sheaf of papers across the polished coffee table. The top page was titled in bold letters, Deed of Renunciation. Chloe stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. Elizabeth? She began, her voice soft and trembling. I want you to know. I never wanted any of this. Richard. He was so generous. I just want to honor his wishes. This house, it's too much. But he insisted. Elizabeth looked at her. Really looked at her. She saw the flicker of Eleanor Vance's eyes, the ghost of a face she had tried so hard to forget. The performance was flawless, but Elizabeth could see the cracks. She could see the desperate hunger beneath the gentle facade. She let the silence hang in the air, a palpable thing. She let them watch her, waiting for the tears, for the capitulation, for the shaking hand to reach for the pen. Jacob shifted his weight, impatient. Sarah's smile tightened. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the thick atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. Before I sign anything, she said, her gaze moving from Jacob to Sarah, to the lawyer, and finally landing on Chloe. There are a few things you all need to understand, a few pieces of family history that Richard neglected to mention in his final performance. She nodded subtly to Mia. Mia's thumbs swiped across her phone screen. On the far wall, the enormous dark screen of the smart TV flickered to life. Jacob frowned. What is this, Mia? Turn that off. But it was too late. An image appeared on the screen. A black and white photograph, grainy but clear. A smiling man and woman, their arms around each other, standing in front of the marquee of an opera house. The man was a younger Richard. The woman was not Elizabeth. I believe you all recognize my husband. Elizabeth said, her voice a cool, steady narration. The woman with him is Eleanor Vance. This was taken in 1995. The opera was Tosca, a tragic story of love, betrayal, and suicide. How prophetic. The image on the screen changed. It was a series of financial documents highlighted in yellow, a hostile takeover bid, Sterling Industries versus Vance and Son, while Richard was sleeping with Eleanor. Elizabeth continued, her voice never wavering. He was systematically dismantling her husband's company. He used the information she gave him in moments of intimacy as a weapon to destroy her family from the inside out. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to annihilate. Jacob shot to his feet. Mother, this is insane. These are lies. Dad won that company fair and square. Sit down, Jacob. Elizabeth commanded, her voice ringing with an authority he hadn't heard in decades. He froze, then slowly, reluctantly sat. The screen changed again. A newspaper clipping. The headline was stark: Socialite Eleanor Vance dead in apparent suicide. The date was May 1996. A smaller photo showed a grim-faced Julian Vance being led away by police for questioning. After the company was bankrupted and Julian was publicly humiliated, Elizabeth's voice dropped, becoming heavy with the weight of the words. Eleanor found herself with nothing. Her husband was a broken man, her family's name was destroyed, and her lover had discarded her. So she took her own life. But she wasn't alone when she died. The image on the screen changed one last time. It was a scan of a faded, childish drawing, a crayon sketch of a stick figure family under a smiling sun. It was the drawing from the rosewood box. Beside it was a scanned copy of a coroner's report. Mia had highlighted a single sentence. Item found, clutched in deceased's hand, a child's drawing. A choked sound escaped Chloe's throat. Her face had gone chalk white, her carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. She had a daughter. Elizabeth said, her eyes boring into Chloe's. A little girl who loved her. A little girl Richard took after her mother was dead. He didn't adopt her out of kindness or guilt. He stole her. He stole her as the final trophy of his conquest, a living symbol of his victory over the Vance family. She rose from the sofa and walked slowly toward Chloe, who was trembling, her eyes wide with horror and dawning catastrophic understanding. Elizabeth stopped just before her. Her voice was no longer cold. It was filled with a terrible, ancient pity. "He didn't give you a home, Chloe." She whispered the words, precise and devastating. "He gave you your mother's tomb." Chloe stared at her, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The truth was a physical blow knocking the air from her lungs. She stumbled backward, collapsing onto the hearth, her body racked with silent sobs. Elizabeth turned away from the broken girl and faced her son. Jacob's face was a mottled canvas of fury and fear. "And the company he gave you," she said, her voice hardening again, all pity gone. "The great Sterling Industries you're so proud to inherit. Did you ever wonder why he kept you so far from the real books? Why your position was always about PR and never about operations?" The TV screen shifted to a complex web of flowcharts, a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations registered in places like the Cayman Islands and Panama. "It's a phantom," Elizabeth declared. "A ghost propped up by decades of fraud. For 30 years, Richard has been laundering money, hiding assets, and cooking the books to hide the fact that the core business has been bleeding money for a decade. It's an empty shell, Jacob. A house of cards. You're lying." Jacob stammered, his eyes darting wildly between his mother and the screen. "You're a bitter, hysterical old woman." "Am I?" Elizabeth asked calmly. Mia, who did Ben Carter forward this particular file to this morning, Mia looked up from her phone. "A senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He said the official investigation will begin Monday morning. Your inheritance, Jacob, isn't a fortune. It's a prison sentence." The color drained from Jacob's face. He looked at the lawyer, Mr. Davies, who was staring at the television screen, his mouth agape, the legal papers forgotten on the table. He looked at his wife. Sarah, however, was made of harder stuff. A sneer twisted her lips. She let out a short, sharp laugh. "An old woman's fantasies. Elaborate, I'll give you that. You've been watching too many movies, Elizabeth. You have no proof, no power. You're nothing. A penniless widow dependent on our charity." Elizabeth looked at her daughter-in-law, at the venom and arrogance that had festered for so many years. She almost felt a pang of gratitude. Sarah had just provided the perfect cue for the final act. Penniless. Elizabeth said, a thin, genuine smile finally playing on her lips. That is where you and Richard made your most critical error. You both saw me, but you never truly looked. She took a step toward the center of the room, taking command of the space. 30 years ago, when my parents passed away, they left me a small inheritance, a modest sum. Richard called it my little hobby fund. He found it amusing, this little bit of money that was mine and mine alone. He encouraged me to play with it, to give me something to do while he was off building his empire. He never once asked what I did with it. He simply didn't care. It was beneath his notice. Her smile widened. But I did not play with it, Sarah. I invested it. Every penny. With a financial advisor Richard never knew existed. An old friend of my father's who was, shall we say, not a fan of my husband's business ethics. For 30 years, that little hobby fund has been growing, compounding, diversifying. I haven't touched it. I just let it grow a secret garden no one else knew about. While Richard's phantom empire was rotting from the inside out, my small, insignificant fortune was quietly, steadily blooming. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suffocating silence of the room. Jacob and Sarah stared at her, their faces frozen in disbelief. I am not a penniless widow. Elizabeth stated, her voice resonating with the pure, clean power of a bell. I am and have been for some time an independently wealthy woman. I don't need a single dollar from Richard's tainted estate. I don't need your generous stipend. I don't need anything from any of you. It was a staggering blow, but she wasn't finished. The final checkmate was yet to be played. Her gaze fell upon the house itself, the walls, the windows, the very foundation of their false victory. And this house, she said, her voice dropping to a soft, almost conversational tone. This grand prize, your symbol of triumph, it's going nowhere. Sarah laughed again, a brittle, uncertain sound this time. What are you talking about? It's Chloe's now. The deed is clear. Oh, the deed is clear. Elizabeth agreed. But ownership has its limitations. You see, years ago I undertook a little project of my own, a passion project, historic preservation. I became quite involved with the town's historical society, made friends, allies. I served on the board for a decade. She walked over to a framed print on the wall, a lithograph of the house from the 19th century. She ran a finger along the frame. I used Richard's own vanity against him. I convinced him that this house, this monument to the Sterling family, was a vital piece of Greenwich's history. He loved the idea, the prestige, the plaque by the door. So with his enthusiastic support and the full backing of the Preservation Board, I had the house officially registered. She turned back to face them, her eyes gleaming with a victory that was decades in the making. This house is a Grade 2 historical landmark, she announced, citing its unique architectural and familial significance to the town's history. It cannot be sold. It cannot be mortgaged. No significant alterations, architectural or otherwise, can be made to the property without the unanimous approval of the Historical Preservation Board. A board, I might add, where I still have many dear, dear friends. The reality of her words began to dawn on their faces, a slow, creeping horror. The house wasn't an asset. It was a liability, an inescapable, unsellable public prison. You wanted this house. Elizabeth said, her voice a silken whisper that filled every corner of the room. Then you shall have it. You, Chloe, can live here in the house your true father's nemesis built as a permanent living tribute to his crimes. You, Jacob and Sarah, can watch as your inheritance turns to ash, knowing your greatest prize is nothing more than a gilded cage. It will stand here for all of Greenwich to see, a public monument to the greed and cruelty that transpired within its walls. The story is out now. Everyone on that live stream knows. Everyone in this town will know by morning. This won't be a home. It will be a spectacle. She looked at her son, her daughter-in-law, at the lawyer, who looked like he was about to be physically ill, and at the weeping girl by the fireplace. They were flies, caught in a web they hadn't even seen being spun. Their victory had turned to dust in their mouths. Elizabeth turned and walked toward the door. Mia was already there, holding it open, her phone now back in her purse. The live stream was over. The bomb had been detonated. At the threshold, Elizabeth paused and looked back one last time at the wreckage of her former life. "Enjoy the house," she said, her voice clear and final. "You've certainly earned it." And then she walked out into the cool afternoon air, leaving them to their tomb. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound of a final, irrevocable end. The play was over. She was at long last free. The silence in the small hotel room was a strange, temporary thing. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the Greenwich mansion, heavy with 50 years of unspoken words. It was the quiet of a held breath, the moment after the lightning strike and before the thunder rolls across the sky. Mia sat on the edge of her bed, her laptop glowing, her face illuminated by the cascade of information. My phone, which I'd placed on the nightstand, buzzed incessantly, a frantic, angry insect I had no intention of swatting. "It's out," Mia whispered, her voice laced with awe. "The stream... Someone clipped the entire confrontation, and it's everywhere. It's on Twitter, TikTok, it's being re-uploaded to YouTube by the second." I didn't look at her screen. I didn't need to. I could feel the digital shockwave emanating from her small device, a tsunami of judgment and fury I had unleashed with a few calm, deliberate sentences. I walked to the window and looked down at the anonymous city street below. The cars moved like blood cells through an artery oblivious. Up here in this sterile, quiet room, we had just detonated a dynasty. "The hashtag is trending," Mia said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "#1 worldwide. Justice for Elizabeth." She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Grandma." "They're listening. Everyone is listening." A faint, tired smile touched my lips. "It was never about them listening to me, Mia. It was about Jacob, Sarah, and Chloe finally hearing the truth. The rest is just noise, but it was a deafening noise." Mia, ever my conduit to this new world, began reading excerpts from The Storm. Oh, wow. 50 years of silent suffering. Elizabeth Sterling is the quiet warrior we never knew we needed. Here's another one. "Forget true crime, this is true justice. The ultimate takedown of a generational curse." Someone on TikTok set your speech, the part about the house being a tomb, to this really dramatic, sad music. It has over 10 million views already. My phone buzzed again. This time, Mia glanced at the screen. "It's Ben Carter." I nodded. "Answer it. Put it on speaker." Mia tapped the screen, and the voice of the man who had given my truth a platform filled the room. His usual smooth narrative tone was gone, replaced by a raw, crackling energy. "Elizabeth, are you there? Are you okay?" "I'm here, Ben," I said, my voice steady. "My God," he breathed. "Elizabeth, I have never seen anything like this." We dropped the episode an hour ago. The stepmom and the tomb. Our servers crashed twice. The download numbers they're not just numbers, they're a statement. It's a global phenomenon. People from London, from Tokyo, from Sydney, they're all sending messages of support. We've had to bring on volunteers just to moderate the comments. "Thank you for your work, Ben," I said simply. "You gave the evidence a voice. You gave it a soul," he countered. "Listen, the media is going to be a feeding frenzy. They're already camped outside the Greenwich house. They're trying to find you. Do you have a plan? Do you need help?" "My plan is already in motion," I replied, looking over at Mia, my co-conspirator, my legacy. We're fine. But keep reporting, Ben. The story isn't finished. What do you mean? Just then, a news alert flashed on Mia's laptop screen. She gasped. Grandma? Look. She turned the laptop towards me. A breaking news banner from a major network was plastered across the top. Breaking federal agents from the SEC and FBI are conducting a raid on the headquarters of Sterling Industries in Manhattan. Sources confirm the investigation is linked to allegations of massive financial fraud first brought to light in a viral podcast episode released this morning. I met Mia's gaze, and for the first time, a genuine, deep-seated relief washed over me. The first foundation stone of Richard's corrupt empire had just been pulverized. That's what I mean, Ben, I said into the phone. The truth is a seed. It just needed to be planted in the right soil. Now, we just have to watch it grow. The days that followed were a blur of headlines and broadcasts, a storm we watched from the calm eye of our anonymous hotel. We saw images of a pale, shaken Jacob being led from his office by men in dark suits, his face a mask of disbelief. We saw Sarah, her face contorted in a snarl, lunging at a photographer outside her lawyer's office, the perfect society wife image shattering into a million ugly pieces. Their assets were frozen. Their friends vanished overnight. Their names, once a currency of influence in Greenwich, were now synonymous with disgrace. They were social lepers, shunned and radioactive. And Chloe. Chloe was the most tragic spectacle of all. The news helicopters circled the Greenwich mansion like vultures. Reporters stood at the gates for days shouting her name. Where's Chloe started trending a morbid counterpoint to my own hashtag. But she never emerged. The house Richard had given her, the monument to his final cruel victory, had become her prison. The historical designation I'd secured years ago meant she couldn't sell, it couldn't mortgage, it couldn't even change the facade without a committee's approval. She was trapped, the living embodiment of a predator's legacy rattling around in a gilded mausoleum. She wasn't an heiress. She was a ghost, haunting the tomb her mother's ruin had paid for. One evening, after watching a news segment detailing the complete implosion of the Sterling family, Mia finally turned off the television. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was clean. It was the silence of a slate wiped clean. It's done, she said quietly, not looking at me. You won. I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. This was never a game, Mia. There are no winners here. There are only survivors. I looked at the dark screen, at the reflection of the two of us. And now the survivors have work to do. It's time to build something, not just watch things burn. I never set foot in the Greenwich house again. It had served its purpose. It was no longer a home or a cage. It was a monument to a lie, a public headstone for a rotten dynasty, and that was all it needed to be. Our departure wasn't dramatic. There were no tearful goodbyes to a life I was already detached from. Mia and I packed our few belongings from the hotel and the small, precious box of mementos I had kept. We drove to the airport and bought 2 one-way tickets to California. I chose a small, quiet coastal town, a place where the air tasted of salt and the horizon was an endless, clean line. The frantic energy of the East Coast, with its old money and older secrets, felt a world away. Here, the only currency was the rhythm of the tides. We rented a simple house with a porch that faced the ocean, and for the first time in over 50 years, I felt the oppressive weight lift from my chest. I could breathe. So, Mia said one afternoon, as we sat on that porch watching the waves roll in. She had her tablet in her lap, but for once it wasn't filled with news feeds. It was a blank document, a foundation. Where do we even start? I smiled, sipping my tea. We start with the name, and there is only one name it could ever be. Mia looked at me, a soft understanding in her eyes. She typed the words at the top of the page. The Eleanor Foundation. It has to be for her? I said, my voice thick with an old, carefully stored grief. Her life was the price of my silence. Her daughter was the weapon Richard used against me. It's time her name means something more than a tragedy. It's time it means hope. Over the next few weeks, we built it. My carefully managed inheritance, the small sum my parents had left me that I had secretly diligently grown for 30 years, became the seed money. It was my secret, my independence, the one part of my life Richard had never known about and could never touch. It was my freedom fund, and now it would be used to fund the freedom of others. Mia was the architect of its modern structure. She designed the website, set up the social media presence, and researched the best non-profit lawyers. I was the architect of its soul. We spent hours at our small kitchen table, hammering out the mission statement. It can't just be about financial aid, I insisted one evening, pushing a draft back to Mia. Money is a tool, but it's not the cure. The deepest wounds Richard inflicted weren't financial. They were psychological. He made me believe I was small. He isolated me. He convinced me that my reality was wrong and his was right. That's the prison so many women are in. Mia nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. So we provide more. Legal resources for women who feel trapped in abusive legal arrangements. Connections to therapists who specialize in complex psychological abuse, in gaslighting. Yes, I said, feeling a surge of purpose that was more potent than any revenge. We create a network, a sisterhood of survivors. We teach them how to untangle themselves from financial manipulation. We show them how to build their own secret funds, just like I did. We give them not just a lifeline, but a blueprint for a new life. We empower them to become their own liberators. My story, once a source of deep, private shame, became the Foundation's origin story. I did one final extensive interview, not with a news outlet, but for our own website. I told it all not for spectacle, but for context. I explained how the grand gestures of a powerful man could be the bars of a cage. I explained how silence can be a poison you are forced to drink every day. The story went up on the website, and the response was overwhelming. Not from the media, but from women. Emails flooded our new inbox. Women from all walks of life sharing their own stories of being trapped by powerful, manipulative partners. A doctor whose husband controlled every penny she earned. A stay-at-home mother whose husband had systematically cut her off from every friend and family member. An artist whose partner constantly belittled her work until she stopped creating. They were all Eleanor. They were all me. We can't help them all, Mia said one night, her voice heavy as she read through the heartbreaking messages. No, I agreed, looking out at the dark, churning ocean. But we can help one, and then another, and we can build something that will help the one after that. This isn't about saving the world, Mia. It's about lighting a single candle in a dark room, and then handing that candle to someone else so they can light their own. The work was my salvation. It filled the silence not with noise but with meaning. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer haunted me. They were reminders. They were fuel. I was no longer Elizabeth Sterling, the disgraced wife, or the vengeful matriarch. I was simply Elizabeth, a woman who had found her purpose not in the ashes of her old life, but in the foundations of a new one. Months melted into a year. The noise of the scandal faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of the Pacific. The world moved on, as it always does. Jacob, after a lengthy trial, received a prison sentence that was more of a whimper than a bang, his vast inheritance turning into a mountain of legal debt. Sarah divorced him and disappeared into obscurity, her name a forgotten footnote. The Greenwich house remained a dark monument on a manicured lawn, its sole inhabitant a ghost of the media's creation. My new life was an exercise in beautiful simplicity. I lived in a minimalist, sun-drenched apartment with a wall of glass that looked out over the ocean. The silence here was not oppressive, nor was it empty. It was peaceful. It was the sound of contentment. It was the sound of freedom. This morning, I sat at a simple wooden desk, a single sheet of elegant cream-colored stationery before me, a pen in my hand. I had thought about this for a long time, this final, unposted correspondence. It was the last thread, the last piece of the story that needed to be written, even if no one else ever read it. I began to write my hand, steady my thoughts clear. The letter was addressed to Chloe. I could picture her in that cavernous house, surrounded by opulent furniture that felt like gravestones. I could picture her staring at the same walls I had, feeling the same suffocating pressure. Only her prison was one she had mistaken for a prize. I wrote about Eleanor. Not the victim from the news clippings, but the woman in the photograph I'd found, the one with the hopeful smile. I wrote about what it must have been like for her loving a man who was a predator disguised as a savior. I wrote about how Richard didn't collect objects. He collected people, and he broke them for his own amusement. Then my pen slowed. I wrote the words that were the heart of it, all the final truth she needed to hear, whether she was ready or not. He built your life on the foundations of another woman's ruin. He told you it was a legacy, a home, a kingdom. But a house built on a grave can never be a home. It can only be a tomb. That is not an inheritance. It is a curse. He didn't give you a future. He chained you to his corrupt past. I know you are trapped in there. I know you feel the weight of it. Your only path to freedom is not to live in the monument he built for his ego. Your only path is to be the one who finally, for the sake of your mother, for the sake of your own soul, tears it all down. I put the pen down. I read the letter one last time. I would not send it. This act was for me, not for her. It was the closing of the final chapter in my own mind. Her liberation was a journey she had to choose for herself. I had found mine. I folded the letter, slid it into a plain envelope with no address, and placed it in the back of my desk drawer. A final piece of a past that no longer had any power. I stood up and walked to the window, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. I looked out at the endless expanse of the ocean, the water glittering as if filled with a million diamonds. A true smile, one that reached my eyes and softened the lines of a long, difficult life, graced my lips. The performance was over. The 50-year play had finally reached its epilogue, and I, at long last, was free. The story of Elizabeth Sterling might have ended there, but the stories of countless other women are just beginning. What part of Elizabeth's journey resonated with you the most? The quiet endurance, the strategic takedown, or the purposeful rebuilding? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss the many forms that strength and freedom can take. Your voice is part of this conversation.